Welcome you to Africa Report News. We're coming to you live from Johannesburg, and this episode we want to talk about journalists today. We out of the streets, we out of the conflicts where you always find us in the middle of things that are happening. Today we want to take you out and tell you how journalists are working and what are some of the difficulties that they face when they cover things like protests, when they go into countries when there's war like in Ukraine. How does a journalist still report and still remain objective and still be able to survive? Of course, you know, we are also people before we are journalists, so when bullets come, they don't care whether they're journalists or not a journalist. So we've got guests today that we're going with, but before I introduce you to our guests, my name is Tuso Kumalo. I'm going to ask my colleague Bongan Siziba also to introduce to you and tell us briefly about what we're going to be talking about today. But today we want to talk about journalists, how they work, how do we bring the stories to here, what kind of hustles do we go to when we go into a hot situation, what kind of things happen to us, what dangers are we facing, and when we report, how can we remain objective despite the fact that some of these stories you find yourself having to take sides because you've got vested interest, but as a journalist you still have to remain neutral.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Bongani Siziba. Welcome to our program. Today we are with guests where we are going to talk about how as journalists we report out there, how to be objective. We know that especially here in South Africa, a lot of conflict has been happening and we find ourselves in those conflicts and we don't know sometimes how to report those stories and how to put them across, especially to our audiences. Then you find that there are debates that are out there whereby our audiences think that us as journalists, we are not being objective. We are taking sides on the stories. I'm joined with by Tinamo and Mary, who will take us through on reporting as a journalist, being objective. Welcome to the program, and please, can you introduce yourself?
Well, thank you very much. My name is Chamano Makadi. I am the chairperson of Education and Training Committee under the South African National Editors Forum.
Thank you. Can you introduce yourself, ma'am?
Thank you. My name is Mary Papaya. I'm the chair of Media Freedom at the South African National Editors Forum, but I also serve as a mentor, a coach, and a trainer for journalists.
I'll start with you, Mary. How should us as journalists handle such conflicts when, when you are reporting on xenophobia, you are in the war zone, and you need to be objective? What would you say a journalist, what are the ethics that a journalist should follow in their reporting?
It's very important, first and foremost, to talk about the climate that journalists are working in right at the moment. In South Africa, on the continent, and the rest of the world. It is very dangerous, and journalists themselves under huge threat. So let's look at some of the conflicts you mentioned. When it comes to the xenophobic attacks, it's very important for journalists to understand the source of the conflict. We find that it's very easy sometimes to just report the two sides, but in any conflict situation, there are various sides to the story. There's the side from the communities, there's the side from the ordinary people who are affected, and if you dig further, you'll find that there are common agendas between ordinary people. And therefore it's upon the journalist to go and find those sides of the stories. Yes, by all means tell us what the leaders are saying, but that should not be the case because leaders in the conflict have vested interests. They will only give a certain agenda. And by finding the other stories, journalists can help ease the tensions rather than inflame it.
Sometimes some of these issues, they're kind of straightforward to journalists. I know these ones are wrong. These ones are on the wrong side of the law and on the side. As a journalist, can I just pick up that and run with that line that these attacks, these have committed all atrocities, considering what Mary have said, that you have to dig deeper? Can I just go on with my own knowledge, or I still have to go down to the communities and ask?
It's always important to dig deep and understand what the issues are. Especially when you are going into conflict environment, because as a journalist you also don't want to be the one influencing communities or fueling the tension which is already there. So how you report on those stories, it's always important that you understand first the issues. Um, Obviously, that comes with you understanding the causes as well. And I will always say that our job, more than anything, is not to get people to fight. I mean, I can cite many examples. I mean, think back to June, July, and I mean 2021, a situation playing out of Nkandla, outside the homestead of former President Jacob Zuma. And here you have a situation that if it is not well managed, and I mean by means of reportage, right, you can end up with a situation where people are fighting when it is actually not necessary. So you always have to make the right calculations. I mean, I can go further and talk about what we saw again playing out in the very same province. Whether you want to talk about what happened in Phoenix, but from a position of a journalist, how do you go about telling those kind of stories? So it's a craft that comes with a lot of responsibility.
Just I'll pick that with you also, Mary, before I give my colleague. Sometimes, say in places like Ukraine, obviously you are in the protection of the Russian army, you are accompanying the Russian army, and they come times to report. How do you get to be neutral? Because these are the people that it's a war situation. You depend on them because you are going with them, but they are doing things that you think they are not right. How do you remain neutral in such a situation?
I think it's important to understand that countries that have a democratic protection of the role of the media, whose constitutions protect journalists, make it a lot easier for journalists to speak against atrocity. So if you look at the Ukraine, I mean, so many journalists have been killed on the Ukraine side, as well as international journalists who've been killed, all because they've risked their lives to go and tell the truth. On the other hand, if you look at how dictators work, let's look at Russia, for example. Journalists in Russia have to toe the line. They have to run the propaganda that the Putin government and Putin regime is asking of them to do. So similarly, if they're going with the Russian army, they're not going to report against the atrocities. And that is why I always say to journalists, and when we teach them as well, to say, rather than going into areas with government leaders, with armies and war situations, where there's conflicts with police, try and find independent entities like your non-profits, your NPOs, the Red Cross in war situations, and other independent bodies, the UN, for example, so that you know you're going in with an independent party and you're able to tell your story without fear, without favor.
Talking about that, how can journalists move away from, let's say, when you go with the government to an event, then you find yourself reporting positive things about the government, yet there are things that you should report about, but because they are the ones who took you there, you don't have to speak against. Like, let's talk about the KZN floods. Everyone who is there now is reporting about the floods, but I think there are stories like, why are the people building close to places where when it's raining they can be taken away, but no journalist is talking about that. So how do us as journalists we remain objective, but we also have to question the government, even if they are the people who took us there, how they are doing their job?
There's always that pressure. Sometimes I do find that it's self-inflicted. The important thing is when government or anyone in authority says to us as journalists, we're going to take you there, it's important that we have a boundary with the relationship, to say, thank you, I appreciate your assisting our media. We don't have the resources, we don't have the money. But when I report, I'm going to be forced to be reporting about the facts. I'm going to have to be impartial. Yes, I'm going to give you your side of the story, but I'm also going to get the people's side of the story. In fact, in the floods, the recent floods that devastated KwaZulu-Natal, you saw media running the stories of those families that lost everything. You saw NGOs being spoken to, climate experts, and some media even went further to go to the old transit camps where people from the 2017, 2019 floods were still there to tell their stories. So it's very important that we not feel the pressure. It is hard, it's very difficult when you come from smaller community-based newsrooms, you don't have the resources. There is this thing of, if I go against it, what about future such trips? So I think the relationship has to be open, and I think it's in the South African situation, we have a constitution that fundamentally protects media freedom. And journalists who have that relationship are able to tell members of government, I'm going to report on this, you may not like it, but I will afford you the opportunity to have your say. So balance, impartiality are very critical aspects when it comes to conflict reporting.
Maybe back to you, Chaman. I have an experience with a colleague. They were reporting on the killing or the murder of a Zimbabwean national in Diepsloot, Elvis Nyati, and to an extent whereby the other group that is accused of committing the murder, they would send very, very insulting messages to this journalist, saying, why are you covering this way? You are taking sides. But as a journalist, we are trying to report the issue as it is. But there's another group that looks violent. They write you messages, SMSs, and threatening that you are not neutral. How do you take care of your protection, your safety, as well as report objectively at the same time?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, because that touches base on some of the issues we were talking about just earlier on in a workshop. It's always important that as a journalist, look after yourself, but that for me would come with have the ability to read the situation. It's very important. Obviously, it's a tense situation. I mean, it's a sort of a common cause that you will have those that will be up in arms, right? And they're dissatisfied about a particular matter. So in that case, I would say find ways as to how do you go about telling that story. Obviously, as a journalist, your first obligation is to truth, right? But even then, I would say find ways of telling a story without compromising yourself, which is very important. But we always try our best as well, and I mean from the position of the South African National Editors Forum. Mary, who is sitting here, she will tell you of projects that we have collaborated even before to talk and address the safety of journalists within the South African context. So we try and sort of play with the different scenarios, and these are really more than anything, I would say, tactics on how you go about telling stories even in volatile situations. So which is always key, because at the end you want to make sure that journalists are protected. I mean, we've heard of many cases like you were talking about the invasion of Ukraine, right? But how do you tell a story even in a war conflict zone or situation? So these are some of the things that we try and address.
Yeah. just to round up, it's starting to get heated, but we have limited time. But just to round up, Mary, how would a journalist separate us journalists? How would you separate ourselves from citizen journalism and being a journalist, whereby you just see something on Twitter, you retweet that? You didn't confirm, or you don't have evidence of what you are tweeting, but you just retweet. How do we separate ourselves from that?
I think it's important for journalists to understand that when we speak on social media as a journalist, we actually are still journalists. So we have to be very mindful of the matter of ethics, credibility, facts, so on and so forth. We are not individuals. We are not ordinary members of the public. So we literally have to hold ourselves to a higher order than most. There's this thing out there in society about we have to be first with the story, we have to have the scoop. That puts a lot of pressure on journalists who want to go out on social media and break stories without checking facts. The problem with that is that social media has made anybody and everybody a journalist. Members of the public will put stuff out on social media without verifying it. So the journalist is still the trusted force. And the trust in the media has to constantly be the one true North Star that guides us. Because if the public trust and the deficit in the public trust is falling lower and lower, then we're in a very precarious situation. So I would say first, fact, check it, make sure that it's right, even if it takes you a few seconds longer. Make sure it's right before you put it out. It really shouldn't be about breaking the story. Imagine you lose your credibility on social media. It takes you such a long time to get back to where you were.
Okay, just my burning question before we close it up to Chamano. Sometimes the pressure does not only come from the newsroom, like she's saying, break the story. It doesn't only come from the ordinary audience. I've got some colleagues in countries where that pressure comes from the government, that this you cannot report, this you cannot say for sure what it is. You have to find ways, and you get arrested. I mean, we've got a case in Zimbabwe. One journalist has been in and out of prison. Lucky enough for him, he's managed, he's able to see himself through the lawyers. But some of these journalists are freelancers. You know, if you get behind there, you can be there for a year and nothing happens to you. How do you handle such a situation? You know what happened. You have asked the people, you have investigated, but you just cannot say it.
These are the things that we must always guard against. Very important that as media we guard against this. And I would also add and say ordinary people, they must also guard against this, because in a context of South Africa, for example, this is at the heart of our democracy, right, which is still very young, and you cannot have a situation where journalists must be told what to say and what not to say. And that's a very, very dangerous situation, because if we get to such a space, it simply means that those that are in authority, we will not be able to hold them to account. Yes, there would be days when someone has done something wonderful, we clap hands, that's fine. But when we now have to ask you tough questions, ask you to account, you must account. And asking you to account, it doesn't mean we are fighting. We simply want you to account, because the office which you hold, it's a public office, right? You are working for the people, and that's very important. Otherwise, then we end up seeing these kind of situations like you are citing an example of what we already know of in the case of Zimbabwe, for example, Hopewell Chinono, who is one day out, the other day he's arrested. And that is a serious problem. I mean, you can imagine in a situation where you would even want to take somebody's personal belongings. I mean, in the case of his Boer goats, it's really terrible. You cannot have a situation like that. I mean, if the truth of the matter is that the health system has deteriorated. You cannot go and try to sugarcoat it. There are problems with the health facilities. I mean, there are problems with road infrastructure. Those things, unless if it is it's in a play, in a drama, right, where you want to make it look like what it is actually not. But in real life, where we have to tell stories about real issues of life, we must give journalists the independence to tell those
But
stories.
just to come in, okay.
Can I just, I think there's something we all forget. The African Union has a press freedom attaché. The African Union has a press freedom charter. All countries subscribe to the UN press freedom specifics and charters. And then we have the Windhoek Declaration, all for Africa. Sometimes it's important for journalists to have, and I think when we talk protection of journalists, we must talk about organizing. We've got the All Africa Editors Forum tie-up, the South African National Editors Forum, and we've got the Southern African Editors Forum. And occasionally they come together. And when we have the incidents like what happened to Mr. Chinono, like what happened to journalists elsewhere in the country, we are talking about it. It's about vigilance. Press releases are put out. Government leaders are forced to engage each other. It's that vigilance that we need for the continent to make sure that his goats are returned. Because if we don't talk about it and we don't immediately raise it when it happens, it will continue to happen. And we know why it happens. It's about control. It's about manipulation of the press. But those of us who can must talk about it. And I think that organization is so important to create these bodies.
But in this case, you have two choices: to tell the story or go to prison. In Zimbabwe, it's usually exactly so. Do you walk away, or what do? You are given two choices, and they're very serious. They mean it. It's either you choose to go to prison or you shut your mouth.
If it means going to jail, let it be so. You know, not so long, Mary will tell you, we were talking about that secrecy bill, right? And I'm glad that our people here, they could see what was coming their way. You cannot have a situation where if, I mean, in most cases you work on investigative pieces, right? And it means digging information.
Deeper, yes.
And unless you do so, you are never going to, get to the bottom of the issues. You can imagine if you have told this story, the next day you are going to jail for 6 months. I can tell you that already is one of the signs that tells you there is a problem here. And that's why I'm even saying we must go beyond. We as media practitioners, I'm saying society must be aware of these things so that when we stand up together, right? And that's why just about, was it 3-4 years, Mary would confirm this, when we had to relook at our organization at SANEF. Our motto as it stands, we say SANEF is about South Africa. Yes, part of what we do, in the main, it is about media championing media freedom, but there are these issues that affect all of us as as society, where we need to always be vigilant and guard against.
That's an issue that you cannot exhaust, as you can tell, and as you can see that there's quite a lot that comes into journalism, into reporting a story. It's not a matter of getting into the crowd and just telling things that you hear. You need to dig deeper, as they are saying, and find the truth. And when you find the truth, you have got to tell it as it is. So you cannot be a journalist and run around, run with something that you get from social media and you think is fine and I'm breaking the story. So these are some of the principles that journalists go under or go through in order to tell a story. But obviously, there are also issues of the safety as well, that while you tell a story, sometimes in journalism we say there's no story worth dying for. If the situation is too tight, you retreat and you go in when you think it's safer to do so. Africa Report News, we're just bringing to you about what happens behind, some of the things that happens behind the scene. You know that we've been talking about media freedom recently, the freedom to report, the freedom of association, the freedom of information. These are some of the things that as journalists we strive to bring to you, but they have got to be based in truth. This is our first obligation, as we have said. As we've heard from one of our guests, that our first is to tell the story as it is, not mixed, and of course without fear and favor, despite who is involved, despite whether it's a government official or is the president himself. The story has to be told, and it is up to you out there, not us, for you to judge for yourself and to see if what we're telling is true. Africa Report News, remember, we've got also our Facebook page there. Search for it and find us there. Also our Twitter page, find it there, and tell us some of the things that you'd want to hear more, especially about how journalists, sometimes we tell stories and we think we're lying, and some of those things we've got to raise them, because it is the society that is affected by whatever we report. As you heard also from our guests, we don't need to fuel the situation or raise the situation that have gone out of control. We don't have to be facilitators of making it worse than it is. So for us, we're rounding it up now. I'll give you to my colleague to round it up, and from me to Sokumalo, I say let's meet next time.
Yes, as journalists, we should be objective and present news as they are, but don't convey your feeling. We are reporters, we report news, we educate, but let's leave our feelings out of our work. From me, Bongani Siziba, Africa Report News, and from our guests, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for joining us. Meet next time.